Hello and welcome back. This is the last time this week I remind you on Slido. So we will use again for the keynote Slido for taking your questions. So if you go to slido.com and use the hashtag OP Digital for asking your questions and voting for questions, that would be excellent. We will have time at the end for taking those. I always wonder how time is flying by during OOP, no matter if digitally or in person. And believe me, I really do hope next year we will meet in person in Munich. Anyway, this means I have now already the honor to announce our amazing and final keynote speaker. Her expertise on the impact of artificial intelligence and what is needed to ensure equity and fairness are requested, I would say, by everyone. At least that's how it feels to me. So no matter if these are corporations, startups, and even governments, they all alike seek her advice. Thus, I'm super proud that she made it to OOP this year. So join me in welcoming Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer. The stage is yours, or well, the screen is yours.
Wonderful. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here, and I've been looking forward to giving this talk since it covers so many of the areas that, as you mentioned, are top of mind for those of us who work in the tech industry, as well as for people outside of the industry. So to get us started, I wanted to consider a little context setting. And I wanted to set the context by describing where we are today versus where we've been in the past, which is really since around the 2007 launch of mobile devices such as the iPhone. We are living in a data-filled universe that has so many different types of information available, accessible, and being stored in various degrees of security all over the world that there's a lot to get used to and a lot to get up to speed on in terms of what this means for the way we live and the way we move through the world today. The kinds of data that I list in this slide are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the app download data, the types of purchases that you make every day, the types of web browsing and the data points that that generates, the types of travel or travel browsing if you're looking for destinations to visit, the type of health and fitness data that's captured or that's being explicitly sought out by either healthcare professionals or on your phone or device that you may use if you're a Fitbit user to collect various types of data about your daily experience. I get into workplace data last because that's very much a gray area for many, not only because of the lack of clarity around what's allowed and what's coming soon in terms of the data points that are going to be collected, but also in terms of what they would be used for and what the meaning of collecting data, not just around consumer purchases and consumer activity, but also around our daily working lives might mean. Parallel to the process of data becoming a commodity that's sought after, that's consolidated, that's being stored in ever increasing volumes in the cloud or still in physical on-premise servers, is a de-emphasis of the manual processes, whatever they may be, back office, customer processes, supply chain processes that have kind of developed a bad name in parallel with the digital transformation of so many things using IT. The delays and the human factors that lead to increased cost have become de-emphasized, poorly reviewed, poorly regarded by comparison with the almost inevitably favorable description of computer-driven automation, which equals, in business terms, instant efficiencies, and in personal terms, in terms of how individuals tend to consider manual processes vis-a-vis computer-driven processes, there's a tendency to consider human involvement as a risk for error, as a risk for bias, whereas computer systems, at least by many lay people, tend to be considered less risky in those terms, and in terms of the efficiencies that they may bring, a better bet. What does this mean when we're looking at automation in the business context all over the world? It means that for many, many people, automation is equivalent to the software revolution that's overtaken hardware. Whereas hardware led to a lot more time spent on research and development, a lot more time required to be spent on testing, and software accelerated all of that to the point where everything was possible or seemed possible in a very compressed timeline with minimal testing, with iterative releases, and with an incremental approach that tended to make it appear that huge leaps in progress could happen overnight. Automation is having the same kind of effect in that those huge troves of data that are increasingly available to businesses and to governments to access are using automation to speed up the identification of who their audiences really are, whether those audiences are customers or their suppliers or they're any potential partner that could be interesting to understand better in terms of their identifiers. Automation also suggests the speeding of certain transactions. If you look at the image at the bottom of the recommended products to buy on an Amazon interface, you'll see that speeding the purchase decisions, speeding the selection decisions, if you take the same type of recommendation algorithms in the context of HR, these are decisions that are happening faster and faster, aided by computer recommendations. And for business purposes, they mean decisions with minimal or no delay. And these are decisions that are happening at scale. Millions of customers, millions of audience members who can be subjected to this type of incredibly fast decision making. At a small scale, these are the books that are most popular amongst customers like yourself, or on a larger scale. These are the types of activities, these are the types of risks applied to personas that share some of your characteristics. So what we're really talking about, before I go further into describing how automation has morphed in the last few years into this idea of artificial intelligence, is what is automation really at its core? Many people who've been working in the statistical area are unimpressed by the whole rebranding of artificial intelligence, but really at its core, what we're talking about vis-a-vis large stores of data is automation as math. Automation, artificial intelligence, algorithmic predictions are based on statistical formulas that leverage the huge repository of data that's necessary in order to start to identify patterns amongst classified data points, cluster those data points according to perceived or proven correlations, model those data points along whatever the desired outcome or persona may be, and then test the data that's coming in, new data, against the modeled data to see where there are gaps and to see to what extent your predictions are accurate. Another way to look at this is referring to the graph on the side, is just looking at data points on a graph and looking at where the data points, once classified, fall in the great majority, and where they are outliers or they don't necessarily follow the general trend and cluster in different ways or have different dynamics that affect their placement. This sounds fine if we're talking about data as an objective and as a distanced phenomenon that has very little to do with individuals. But if you think about the first slide that I showed, which outlines how human data is what we're talking about swimming in, and human characteristics and habits and purchases and travel plans being the types of data that we're using in order to create these algorithms that will predict for us the likelihood based on the past of future activity, you start to have some questions about what it means to be performing advanced statistical human math. The reasons that these calculations tend to be a little bit blurry in certain applications is that obviously human data is quite diverse. Outliers are people, and the diversity of the data means that it's often very difficult to do some of the basic steps in algorithmic creation and testing. Classifying humans who are diverse in their tastes and their characteristics is more difficult than one might imagine. Handling outliers, particularly if those outliers include potential customers, potential suppliers, potential partners who are still desirable, but they just don't fit the model of where the majority of your customers, your partners, your suppliers may fall on a graph, adds some interesting questions about what it means to engage in large-scale computer-led people classification. Some of the most important questions to be raised about human math is what happens when you have outcomes that are unexpected, and what happens when you take people entirely out of the loop so that you have very few opportunities to guess or to observe what those outcomes will be once you've tested models and you put them into production. There are different algorithms that are becoming incredibly popular already in production in many parts of the world. They may be known as different names. Usually they are referred to as different flavors of artificial intelligence. But again, these are primarily algorithmic. These are algorithms that are in place to identify and optimize certain types of data based on a large trove of historical information. Natural language processing is something that many people are familiar with without necessarily recognizing that's what is involved in chatbots and customer service optimization that has used these algorithms to optimize the routing of calls and to minimize the need to have human moderation in between phone calls for high volume call centers. Computer vision is the specific area within algorithmic inquiry where the visual edge recognition, object recognition is what is being tested, modeled, and optimized such that you can get to a much more accurate recognition and identification of humans, of faces, of whatever object it is that you're trying to identify and categorize. Machine learning is a catch-all phrase, so you may hear machine learning applied to NLP, applied to computer vision, but machine learning is really the process or the procedure by which you are creating pattern recognition algorithms that are looking for different types of patterns, different types of correlations within a large volume of data using, let's say, one limited set of parameters. That is the same thing that you are doing if you are involving a business process operations algorithm to optimize the number of applications that are rejected for being incompletely filled out or having some error that's standard for a certain percentage of those applications. Machine learning is excellent and is widely used when it comes to identifying patterns like that of error, of fraud, of other types of risk. Deep learning is when you add in different layers to the point where your machine learning pattern recognition is an algorithm that's not just taking into account, let's say in the Netflix example that's shown at the bottom, not just whether or not you are someone who goes for genre movies and you're typically going to be more attracted with the data points that identify you as a customer to thrillers or to Westerns or to horror films, but it's actually going to be an algorithm that simulates neural activity involving multiple types of inputs, which means you can be looking at how you respond to the graphics of the movies that you select, how you respond to the director, the gender of the director, many, many, many different types of inputs that are a richer and a denser set of data points from which the algorithm has to create a model and a pattern and a prediction of what movie you're going to select. So what do leaders get from AI? Because the hype has not come about all by itself. What leaders get from AI is pretty much the 4 W's. They get answers immediately, inputs, outputs that are data-driven, do not appear to have any obvious biases, and have quick ways to identify information that in the past was very, very difficult to get a positive answer definitively regarding who your customers are, where your customers are, what characteristics attach or attributes attached to those customers, and why. What are the main data points to be accumulated around why your customers, your suppliers, your partners, whoever it is, are behaving in the ways that they are. So the example that I give contradicts a little bit what leaders get from AI versus what AI is actually equipped to provide. If you take a standard machine learning algorithm, you look at the outputs. This is a facial recognition algorithm, and the standard outputs that you might see for an off-the-shelf or a typical algorithm include lots and lots of the basic characteristics and a few characteristics that seem pretty subjective. On secondary or tertiary evaluation, they seem like the types of data points that are open to interpretation. And that's important to keep in mind because obviously computers are not known for contextualization or interpretation, as they are programmed to interpret facts and only facts. And as algorithms rely on historical data to make decisions that correlate to the historical data they have been trained on, anything that involves interpretation is tricky because it implies the necessity of human input. And human input, when it comes to determining who is young, who is not, who is attractive, and who is not, is a very, very slippery slope. Outside of tech, is important to consider how AI looks, because what we lose sometimes when talking about all the wonders of artificial intelligence and how algorithmic and automation is going to change our world for the better is that for many people who have just a basic understanding of either natural language processing, facial recognition, any type of machine learning or algorithmic optimization that suggests it might touch them in their daily lives, there can be a lot of fear about the risk of exclusion, being left behind. There can be a lot of concern about how quickly these types of algorithms are going to be integrated into work life, personal life, various different kinds of job search, job evaluation processes. And there's a real risk that once you do understand that artificial intelligence is just a buzzword, really, we're talking about algorithms that are looking at historical data and making predictions that are statistical in nature, that only can go as far in imagination, so to speak, as the past data allows. You realize that it's very, very easy for people who are outside of the technical sector or even the technical role area to feel as if maybe they need to be careful, maybe they need to be cautious, maybe they even need to be defensive about where AI is headed. The big data wave has already hit, so that means that there are varying levels of awareness in terms of what's going on with algorithms, who's going to implement them, where they're going to be deployed first, and how obviously they're going to impact our lives. There's also varying levels of regulation. And because AI is actually in its infancy. We don't have the singularity. We haven't had an enormous breakthrough in terms of artificial intelligence algorithms doing more than playing a particular game of cards or chess, or very limited inputs and very predictable outputs. There's a significant gap between the ethics of AI and the awareness that people have of the ethics of AI and the automation hype. Most people are exposed more to Black Mirror and what they think the worst case scenario could be around AI and how they're going to navigate this brave new world of artificial intelligence than they are interested in how AI is already permeating different levels of industry and society. So, as leaders, what I would like to propose is that the first step to becoming an algorithmically savvy leader is to educate and to err on the side of education rather than hype, however tempting it may be, because algorithms that are simply optimizing business processes, mechanical, manual processes, being called AI or AI driven is proliferating to a point that's really quite ridiculous. We have already examples of different types of automation that have been labeled AI and that are already frightening people into believing the future will not have necessarily much place for them. The examples that I list are everything from self-driving cars and automated decision-making software that guides that, as well as new recruitment systems that rely heavily on algorithms based on the past, voice activation of everything from doors to phones, and facial recognition technologies that also allow us, in many cases, to access our phones, to access different workspaces. And a lot of the information that is being circulated is global. So it's not only a concern that you should have what's happening today in Germany or tomorrow in the United States, but it's also the ways that this technology is being adopted in the absence of strong and internationally held standards means that you have to be concerned when a government like the United States government says, we're going to require selfies for anyone to file a tax return, because these are obviously the kinds of decisions that are being watched and that are being potentially duplicated elsewhere. Fear is fueling so much change that it's not enough to simply react and respond to what is being presented as inevitable. We've had so much change in terms of how technology has been integrated more and more into our lives around the pandemic, around the pandemic again with regards to data capture, infrastructure changes and attitudes changing, the need for backups that are instantly available, the need for essentially all of the data that's possible to have at your fingertips, visualized if possible. And because there's not a huge backlog of talent that's specialized in AI development and algorithmic ethics, we have even a rising interest in no-code and low-code solutions similar to what we have in the web space. And this is really frightening, because what this means is that you don't only have a huge group of tech experts who are trying to navigate the changes involved in using AI, but you also have non-tech specialists who are looking to off-the-shelf AI solutions, either promoted by consultants or offered by B2B companies that are offering Databricks and DataRobot and Ex Machina and solutions that, just like Lego blocks, can be added into your existing business strategy to allow you to leverage automation at scale and predictions using, in most cases, human data points with very little understanding of how the data should be handled or any considerations that might be used to mitigate risk. So the ways that I feel it's imperative for anyone who wants to lead in this incredibly shifting, accelerating environment of data everywhere and algorithmic everything is, one, to keep in mind that you will need to create a path that others can follow. Leading in this period of enormous change involves leading. It involves empowering people who want to learn to lead their colleagues and to lead when faced with challenges around embracing what AI will do for them. Keeping up with the Joneses is, again, a big temptation, but it's really not going to get you if you are relying on off-the-shelf solutions, if you are trying to keep a hand in the AI space with different pilot projects. That's not going to be enough for you to bring the people who you want to bring along with you. So you need to create a path that others understand and want to follow. Next, you need to be very careful, and you need to avoid the pitfall of us and them language. In terms of determining what kind of AI your organization will use, you need to develop an awareness of the different types of AI that are being used and what for, and also what the long-term plan is, not just how well the announcement was received that some algorithmically driven solution was put into production, but also what's the long-term plan? Are there sustainability concerns? Are there privacy? Are there ethical concerns? And also, how is the larger organization integrated or meant to integrate into the usage of these technologies in the future? Fourth and most important point to that us versus them pitfall is who's considered data literate. That's a real challenge for many organizations that are trying to incorporate a data-driven approach into their way forward in the algorithmic age. The important thing to remember here is that because artificial intelligence is so young, anyone can become data literate. It's a question of opportunity, and it's a question of inclusion. Another important point and another tool that you can use really in supporting the type of leadership that you want to demonstrate in the algorithmic age is to consider the optics of AI outside, once again, of the tech industry. AI doesn't mean the same thing to everyone because people are having very different exposures and experiences with artificial intelligence based on their identities, their specific characteristics, data points, who they show up as being on a statistical map. There's a huge risk, specifically within Germany, but really everywhere around surveillance. When you're talking about collecting as much data as you possibly can about every aspect of customers, partners, businesses, activities, you're also talking about an infrastructure that can easily turn into a surveillance infrastructure. And that's something that everybody has an interest in avoiding and understanding as much as possible about. So the risk of surveillance is something that alone should drive attitude of transparency and an interest in ensuring that whatever decisions are made around artificial intelligence are not only justifiable, but they're explainable. The fourth point I want to make is that artificial intelligence is frequently marketed as the future, full stop, something that's inevitable, that's great, that's going to mean efficiencies for everyone who can monetize these efficiencies in the business sector. But artificial intelligence does not equal trust, neither amongst the customer-facing folks who are trying to promote and to push adoption of these technologies, nor does it necessarily involve the trust of the people whose data is feeding these algorithms. So as a leader, it's imperative that you consider who's advocating for the human expertise that's driving these algorithms to learn what they need to learn to be more efficient adjusters or more efficient recruiters or to create more accurate visual images of or identifications of certain cancers or whatever algorithms are being used to improve and to optimize. It's important to advocate that humans have the expertise because they have the benefit of having learned and having the ability to learn much faster and at a much greater degree of contextual depth than a computer does. Are you transparent about risks in terms of not just what the algorithms you're interested in can do, but how they might not do exactly what was expected or hoped for? And finally, do you have a long-term vision? And is your long-term longer than 3 years, longer than 1 year? Vision and maintenance plan already in place? Has it been discussed and socialized with the people who will be affected by these technologies? Or is this something that is going to be rolled out as a fait accompli that's already in place and already assumed to work and to lead to efficiencies at every level? Engaging non-specialists is what I'm really getting at here. It's critical whether you're talking about working with an IT team that needs to become more comfortable with an algorithmic solution, or you're talking about getting your sales and business team ready to go face new customers at the individual or the business level who are unfamiliar with the type of algorithm that you want to use. Make sure that everyone understands and feels empowered to ask, how does it work? How do we get from raw data points out in the universe to some type of result, some kind of recommendation, some type of prediction that we are going to be asked to depend on and to rely on as if it were coming from a highly skilled human? It's important to make sure that that is happening, that process of opening up to the understanding of non-specialists, as well as that the data in question that's being fed to whatever algorithm is being created, is being used from an off-the-shelf product, that the privacy and the handling of that data is equally well documented and equally well understood. Because at the end of the day, any type of automation, however hyped, may fail, may have unexpected outcomes, and therefore mitigation processes and risk management that's very robust is necessary. Reinforcing human values is something that should be a no-brainer, but I'm mentioning it because it's not always. It is important to recognize that as the technology becomes more sophisticated and we are faster at rolling it out, that learning is really where humans have machines beat. AI can learn whatever we feed it in terms of the data we choose to provide it with, but AI is never going to be able to give people an alternative to taking responsibility for decisions made. And AI is never going to be an excuse to not properly handle human data, the security of that data, and the privacy rights of the people whose data is being used. Ultimately, what I'm saying boils down to 3 things about who will lead in the algorithmic age. It's my belief, and from all of the examples of piloting or large-scale rollouts that I've seen thus far, I'm convinced that leaders who will thrive in the algorithmic age that we're in will highlight the limits of AI as much as they highlight the potential. They will be people who amplify not just how they're using algorithms and what algorithms are meant to do, but also where they shouldn't optimize and where they're not interested in applying algorithms to create efficiencies at scale. Finally, the people who lead, I think, are definitely going to have the responsibility of explaining the why and the where about humans and their involvement at which points in order for AI to succeed at the scale of millions of customers, partners, suppliers, citizens. Leaders who do these things are not leaders who are up against a 500-pound gorilla of public expectation. Leaders who do these things are those who understand how to build community, how to build engagement, and how not to go it alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nakeema. We have a few questions and maybe also a few more will come in. We will see. So the first question is, AI programs are written and learned by people. Therefore, it mirrors our society problems. Do you see a risk that will just make these problems grow? And there's an example like clustering stuff.
I absolutely do. This is 100% correct. They are tools, essentially. Algorithms are written by humans who have societal biases, but more importantly, humans are working with data that reflects the society that we're in today. So as we're not in a perfect and fair and open society, a lot of the data that is being modeled through these algorithms to produce a very close estimate or a very close replica of past circumstances is going to have the kinds of bias that we already see today, but maybe amplified, because rather than having unfair or unequal situations that you can point to an individual and say, maybe they are responsible and maybe we should pick up the concern with an authority there, you're not really able to very easily educate problems that are that derive from algorithmic decision making.
Right. Do we need law regulations like banning personalized ads if no one can earn money by tracking the behavior of people on websites? Not everyone would do it.
I think that we do. I'm firmly in that track, and I'm firmly in that camp because what I think is not necessarily clear to people who are interested in the monetization of online data is that regardless of what we think about the intrusion of these cookie pop-ups and the granting or not granting of permissions, when data is tracking you everywhere you go online, and third-party brokers and who knows who is having access to this data after the fact, these become the equivalent of a kind of online surveillance that many people are not aware is happening. And until you start to get recommendations for really personalized products that there would be no way of knowing about unless you'd been spied upon, it doesn't come together necessarily. But this is exactly where these kinds of strange am I being spied upon moments come from. It's typically online tracking ads that are trying to get as much information about you as possible from whatever different sources.
Right. Would you agree that IT needs to be more diverse since an algorithm cannot be biased, rely on prejudices, but the persons implementing, designing it are?
I think that IT needs to be more diverse because it's really, really hard to see outside of our own experiences as humans, and we're all biased to some extent. So if I'm working with a group of women who look like me, who have similar experiences, education level, and I'm dealing with a data set that's not giving me any obvious red flags of error, it's not going to necessarily occur to me and my colleagues that maybe this algorithm is excluding or discriminating against people different from me. As long as my identifiers and characteristics are being handled fairly, I'm less likely to think about who else would be involved or who might be harmed by an algorithm that's discriminating or unfairly treating those who aren't in the room. And so I think the question ends up being, well, who's in the room when the algorithms are being tested, and who's in a position to say, hey, that looks like it might exclude or it might unfairly handle the data of people who are not here to advocate for themselves.
Yes. And do you think there will be an international standard for ethic values in AI in the near future? And maybe you can even tell when?
Gosh, I wish there would be, but international is where the problem comes from. It's a really long time now that we're dealing with GDPR, and thank goodness we have it, because the differences between how our data is protected and is being projected to be handled under the new AI Act is vastly different than how personal data is handled in North America, how personal data is handled in South America. There are many, many examples around the world, and I think that because of the strategic importance of AI technologies, particularly in the defense area, national security applications, it's unlikely that there will be enough data sharing to lead to an international standard anytime soon.
Mm. No good answer, I'm afraid. When I deny tracking ad recommendation algorithms recommend very low quality shady stuff. Oh my God. Is that normal for a model lacking data points?
When you deny ad tracking data, you shouldn't be recommended. You shouldn't be recommended anything that is particularly skewed one way or the other towards you as an individual. What you might be noticing is that the products that are recommended are less well-known brands, and they're less likely to be companies that are able to spend for that online ad marketing spend. But I wouldn't say low quality. I would say it's really a free for all. What you have access to when you deny tracking cookies is the actual free market of who's trying to get eyeballs on their products. But I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a shady or a lower quality of producer.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is more a philosophical question. Would it be better to use different terms than AI, ML, because they are so closely connected to human experience? And what would they be?
Statistics.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
in favor of calling these technologies what they are, which is, high
And
level
do you also
statistics.
think that this might be a problem already?
I think that the biggest problem that I've seen amongst non-tech specialists is that the idea of applying human characteristics to technologies is frightening. And it tends to provoke the response that, I want to protect my job. I want to protect my viability in society. I'm concerned that an algorithm is going to be preferable to me, a human, when it is assumed to be more effective, more cost efficient, and just better at everything. And I think that's the real concern to this fetishization that we have around artificial intelligence at the moment.
Yes. Any idea how to test an AI? Currently, I feel testing is just an additional training, which often does not reveal the bugs in the training material.
Unfortunately, the recommendation I gave on the next to last slide is probably one of the best ways to test an AI, and that is to make sure that you and the person who is testing the models or developing and then testing the models understands where the data comes from. Everything comes back to who and where and how and under what circumstances and what similarities or discrepancies exist in the original data set. So if you're not able to explain with a good degree of understanding where the data is coming from, what biases might be implicit in the data based on how it was collected or who was sampled, it's going to be very difficult to test the AI and predict the adverse outcomes, such as it's excluding certain people, or it's not ranking certain groups or certain characteristics as highly as you might like. Those are things that unfortunately often come out in big PR scandals after the AI algorithm has been rolled out into production. This is what has happened to Amazon and other companies, and it happens because very often there's not a full understanding of how is the sausage made before it's put into production.
A few years ago, we had Sarah Speakerman as a keynote speaker here at OOP. I'm not sure if you know her. However, she has also co-authored the IEEE 7000 standard. And if you're aware of it, has it any relevance in AI? And maybe it's something different.
I'm not familiar enough with it to comment.
Okay, so whoever asked that question has to explore that for him or herself then. Thank you so much, Nakeema. It was really super great to have you here, and I think it's really such an important topic, and it, I still feel we all don't know enough about it, and therefore I really think this was super helpful that you enlightened us in some areas here, and so we are a bit better prepared. Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.